Etta had been at the Trimble Ranch 11 months when she stopped hoping Silas would ever see her as anything more than his cook. That was the same week 5 riders came up the creek road, and the boy beside her stopped breathing. Whit was 12. He'd been standing on the porch shelling peas into a tin bowl. Quiet work Etta had taught him because idle hands made him nervous, and when the riders appeared at the bend, his chest locked, and he didn't draw another breath until Etta put her hand on his shoulder. "Breathe," she said, quiet as turning a page. He breathed. The riders came in no hurry, which was worse than if they'd been galloping. A man in a hurry might be passing through. A man taking his time owned the ground he was covering. The man in front wore a coat that had cost more than everything in the Trimble house combined. Behind him rode 4 men hired for the specific purpose of making other men feel small. Silas came around the barn with a foal on a line. He saw the riders and stopped. The foal bumped his legs, and he steadied it without looking down. "Before we go further, settle in wherever you are tonight. Kitchen, porch, bedside lamp, wherever these evenings find you. Drop a note in the comments and tell us where you're listening from. We like knowing who's sitting with us when the story turns hard. Because this one does." Silas tied the foal to the rail and walked out to meet them. He moved the way he always moved, slow, deliberate, like a man who'd measured every step before his feet touched the floor. Etta had watched him cross that yard 1,000 times. He never varied. He never hurried. She supposed that was what grief did to a man's legs. Turn walking into something you did because standing still was worse. The man in the expensive coat swung down. He had the look of someone who'd eaten well his entire life. "Trimble," he said. Not a greeting. A label. "Crow," Silas said back. Hollister Crow owned the bank in Virginia City and the mercantile and the livery and, as of 6 months ago, the water rights to Indian Creek, the only creek that fed the Trimble pasture through summer. He'd bought those rights from a man named Purcell upstream, paid next to nothing, because Purcell sold things he didn't understand to men who understood them perfectly. "I'm here to make this simple," Crow said. He didn't take off his gloves. "You've got until the end of the month. Sell me the ranch, house, barn, acreage, and I'll give you fair price. Enough to start over somewhere." "I'm not starting over somewhere." "Then you'll lose it the hard way." Crow looked past Silas at the house, at Etta on the porch, at Whit beside her. His eyes moved over it like a man eyeing cattle he's already bought. "You got yourself a cook now, Trimble. That's touching. Won't save your land." He mounted up. The riders turned, kicking up dust that settled on the railing like flour. Whit wiped it off with his sleeve, and the gesture was so small and so careful that Etta felt something in her chest shift. She had made her peace with not being seen. She had not made her peace with watching these boys get swallowed. That evening, after the boys were asleep, Etta found Silas in the barn, mending a halter by lantern light. "I found something in the trunk in the back room," she said. "Land patent papers. From when this ground was first filed. The original grant includes water rights to Indian Creek, not from Purcell's land, from this land. The water was never Purcell's to sell." Silas's hand stopped. "My father was a county clerk in Umatilla County," she said. "I grew up reading land filings. I know what those documents mean." He set the halter down. He looked at her, really looked at her, maybe for the first time since she'd arrived, and she saw something cross his face that wasn't suspicion. It was fear. "Etta, I know what I'm talking about, Silas. I know you do." He stood. "That's the problem." He walked past her out of the barn. She listened to his boots cross the yard and understood, standing in the dark with the lantern swinging on its nail, that he was not afraid of Hollister Crow. He was afraid of her. The next 3 days, Silas avoided her. He ate breakfast before she came down. He worked the far fence line until dark. When she left food on the stove, he ate it, but he washed his own plate and put it away so she'd have nothing to do in his kitchen. The politest form of cruelty she'd ever experienced. Etta understood avoidance. Her husband, Doyle, 9 years in Baker City, had perfected it. He'd told her she was plain so many times the word became furniture. When he left, he didn't explain. He simply stopped being there, and one morning his clothes were gone from the closet and the space looked like a wound. She had answered an advertisement. A ranch in Montana Territory needed a cook. It did not mention a widower. It did not mention 2 boys. It did not mention a man whose grief was thick enough to lean against. She came anyway, because the alternative was staying in a house that smelled like a man who'd told her she was nothing. But she was not nothing at the Trimble Ranch. She'd discovered that the first week, when Jody, 7, still small enough to be carried, fell asleep against her hip while she shelled beans, and she sat there an hour without moving because she was afraid he'd wake and remember she wasn't his mother. Wood had remembered. Wood always remembered. But he let Etta teach him things: how to mend a button, how to doctor a scrape, how to braid a rope. And she understood that his letting her was not forgetting, but choosing. He was choosing her, a day at a time, the careful way a boy chooses when he's learned that people leave. On the fourth day, Silas came to the kitchen while she was kneading bread. He stood on the other side of the table, and she knew before he spoke, because he was standing the way a man stands when he's about to do something he doesn't want to do but has decided is right. "You should go," he said. She kept kneading. "It's going to get bad." Crow isn't bluffing. He's done this before. The Hadley place, the Perkins Ranch. He chokes them out, cuts the water, runs off the stock. "I can't have you here when it happens." "You can't have me here," she repeated. The boys need someone feeding them while you fight this. The boys need to not watch another person get hurt on their account." She stopped kneading. She looked at her hands in the dough, flour to the wrists, knuckles red, and she thought about how many times a woman is told to leave for her own good by a man who's decided what she can bear without asking her. "I can hold," she said. "Etta, I've held through worse than Hollister Crow." His jaw worked. She watched him form the next words the way you watch a man lift something too heavy. The effort, the strain. "If something happened to you." He stopped. He tried again. "Beth died on this ranch. In that room. While I was out riding fence because I thought it was just a fever. I was a quarter-mile away when she—" He didn't finish. He didn't need to. The sentence broke the way Beth's life had broken. In the middle, without warning, with someone too close to save her. "I'm not Beth," Etta said, gently. Gently, because she knew what it cost him to say that name out loud. "I know you're not. That's why I need you to go." She understood then. It wasn't that he didn't want her. It was that wanting her terrified him, because wanting meant he might lose, and losing meant standing in a room again while someone he cared about slipped away because he hadn't been paying attention. She packed that afternoon. Not much. 2 dresses, a shawl, the flour sack, a tin of her father's papers that she kept because they were the only thing he'd left her besides the knowledge of how to read them. Whit watched from the doorway of her room. He didn't offer to help. He didn't ask why. He stood with his shoulder against the frame and his arms crossed, looking like a 12-year-old who'd practiced losing people long enough to know the choreography by heart. Jody stood behind him, confused, his lower lip doing the thing it did when he was trying not to cry. Etta knelt in front of Jody. She put her hands on his shoulders. "You mind your brother. And eat what's in the blue pot. There's enough for 3 days." "Where are you going?" Jody asked. "Just down the road a piece." "When are you coming back?" She looked at Whit. Whit looked at the floor. He already knew. Old Gant Reeves lived 2 miles down the creek, on the last ranch that wasn't Crow's. He came by that afternoon on his mule and found Etta walking with her bag. He pulled up alongside her. He didn't ask where she was going. He'd seen enough women walk away from enough places to know. "He's a fool," Gant said. "He's afraid," Etta said. "There's a difference. Ain't much of one from where you're standing." The mule matched her pace, which said something about the mule and something about how slow she was moving. "You know about the papers," Gant said. "News in a valley this size traveled downhill and without permission. I told him about the papers. And he let you walk." "He let me walk." Gant was quiet for a while. "My wife walked once," he said. "I was young and stupid, and I thought holding on meant I was weak. Took me 2 years to find her again. 2 years and a war and a scar on my leg I don't need to tell you about." "What did she say when you found her?" "She said, 'What took you so long, you damn fool?'" He almost smiled. "And then she hit me with a skillet." Etta laughed. It surprised her. It was the wrong day for laughing, but it came anyway, and she was grateful for it. What would you have done, hearing a man say that to you? Would you have stayed, believing you could change his mind? Or would you have walked, knowing that some walls are built from love and cannot be climbed from the outside? The ranch without Etta was a house without a fire in the stove. Everything warm was cold. Everything that had smelled of bread smelled of nothing. Jody wouldn't eat. Whit wouldn't speak. The creek was low. Crow's Dam was doing its work. The cattle were thirsty. The pasture was browning. He could feel the ranch dying the way you feel a season turning. Not all at once, but in the slow surrender of one thing after another. On the 3rd night, Crow's men came back. 4 of them. They cut the fence and drove off 20 head of cattle. Silas rode out and found them 2 miles north, dead, shot, and left in a ravine. Not stolen, killed. The message was not "I want your cattle." The message was "I can take anything from you, and there is nothing you can do about it." He rode home in the dark, and when he dismounted in the yard, they were waiting. The first hit took him across the jaw and put him on his knees. The second caught him in the ribs. He tasted blood and dust, and he thought, clearly and without panic, that the boys could see this through the window. He got up. He always got up. That was the thing about Silas Trimble. You could knock him down, but the getting up was automatic, because he had 2 boys in that house who needed him vertical. The third hit put him down again. A boot in the shoulder. His rifle was in the dirt 3 feet away, and he reached for it, and a man stepped on his hand. "Mr. Crow sends his regards," one of them said. "End of the month, Trimble. Or next time, we start on the barn." They left him in the yard. He lay there looking up at the cold Montana stars, and he thought about how a man who has nothing left to lose should feel free, but instead he just felt empty, like a bucket with a hole in the bottom that everything poured through and nothing stayed. What came out first? Barefoot, his face white in the moonlight. He didn't cry. He knelt beside his father and put his hand on Silas's chest the way Etta had taught him to check for breathing, and Silas felt the weight of that hand and understood he'd been wrong about something fundamental. He had thought he was protecting his boys by sending Etta away, but his boys had not needed protection from Hollister Crow. His boys had needed someone to stay. Jody appeared in the doorway holding a piece of bread, dry and stale, from the blue pot. He'd been saving it. He crossed the yard barefoot and held it out. "Papa," he said, "I saved you some." Silas took the bread. He held it. He sat up slowly, and Whit helped him, and the 3 of them sat in the dirt while the stars turned above them. Whit didn't speak for a long time. When he did, his voice was so quiet that Silas had to lean closer to hear it. "We forgot she wasn't our mama." The words hit Silas the way the men's fists had not. Not on the surface, but somewhere behind the sternum, in the place where a man keeps the things he cannot say. He looked at Whit, who was looking at the ground, his jaw set like Silas's when holding something in. Silas saw his own grief in his son's face for the first time, not reflected, but inherited, passed down like the color of his eyes. He had given his son his silence, and his son had learned it well. Jody tugged at Silas's shirt. "Is she coming back, Papa?" Silas didn't answer. He was looking at the bread in his hand, the bread Etta had baked 3 days ago, that Jody had saved because she'd told him there was enough for 3 days, and he believed her. She had never lied to him. She had never been late. She had never made a promise she couldn't keep. She had been the most reliable thing in these boys' lives, and he had let her walk down the road with a flour sack over her shoulder. He stood. His ribs screamed. He ignored them the way he ignored weather, by pushing through it. "Get inside," he told Whit. "Lock the door. Don't open it for anyone but me." Whit took Jody's hand and led him inside. Silas heard the bolt slide home. He saddled the bay mare in the dark, every movement costing him in his ribs, and rode south toward town. He found her in Ennis, at the boarding house behind the feed store. She was sitting on the porch in the dark, her bag at her feet. She wasn't going anywhere. She was sitting the way people sit when they've been told to leave and haven't figured out where to go. He tied the mare to the rail and stood at the bottom of the porch steps, and she looked at him, at the blood on his face, the dust on his shirt, the way he held his ribs, and she didn't say what happened or what are you doing here. She said, "You rode too fast. Your ribs." "Walked into a door," he said. "You walked into several doors." He almost smiled. It hurt. She moved over on the step. He sat down beside her. Somewhere inside, a clock marked time in a hallway that smelled like lye soap and boiled cabbage. Whit said something, Silas said. He looked at his hands, skinned, barely closable. He stopped. The words were simple. 6 words. A child's words. But speaking them aloud to the woman they were about felt like handing her something made of glass. He said, "We forgot she wasn't our mama." Etta didn't move. She sat very still, the way she sat when Jody fell asleep against her. Then she pressed her hands to her face and made a sound that wasn't crying exactly. It was older than crying, more worn, the sound a woman makes when she has been holding something at bay for a long time and it finally gets through. Silas sat beside her and let her make the sound. He didn't touch her. He didn't speak. He had learned, finally, that sometimes the most a man can do is sit close and not leave. When she lowered her hands, her eyes were red and her face was wet, and she looked at him and said, "I forgot too." He told her about Beth. He had never told anyone. Not Gant. Not the boys. Not the preacher who'd stood at the grave. He told Etta in the dark on a boarding house porch in a town she was only in because he'd sent her there. She was sick for 3 days. I thought it was a cold. I was riding fence because the south pasture was dropping wire, and I thought it could wait. She was fine when I left. Sitting up, drinking tea. He swallowed. I came home, and she was on the floor. Jody was too. He was pulling on her arm, trying to wake her up. Etta closed her eyes. "I carry that," he said. "Every day. I carry the image of that boy on that floor. And I told myself I would never again be the man who was somewhere else when someone he loved needed him." He looked at her. "So when I felt what I was feeling for you, I did the only thing I knew how to do. I sent you away before I could fail you the way I failed her." Etta was quiet for a long time. The clock inside marked a full minute. "My husband left me because he said I was plain and ordinary and no man should have to wake up to that for the rest of his life," she said. "He said it the way you'd say a fence needs mending. Just a fact." She looked at her hands. "I believed him. For 9 years, I believed him. And when I came to your ranch and your boys let me feed them and teach them and sit with them when they were scared, I started to think maybe he was wrong. Maybe I was enough." She paused. "And then you told me to go, and I thought, no, he was right. I'm not enough. I was never enough." Silas felt the words land in him like the fist that had broken his rib, not on the surface but deep, in the place where truth lives. "You were never not enough," he said. "I was never not afraid. Those are two different things, and I mixed them up, and I'm sorry." He reached into his shirt and pulled out something small. A wooden horse, rough carved, the legs uneven, the mane a series of nicks. Wood had made it with a knife too big for his hand over 3 weeks, and given it to Silas at the door without a word. Silas held it out. "He said to give you this." Etta took the wooden horse. She turned it in her hands, ran her thumb over the mane, the rough legs, the careful body. It was the ugliest horse she'd ever seen and the most beautiful thing anyone had ever given her. "He carved it while you were gone," Silas said. "Wouldn't eat, wouldn't talk. Just sat on the porch with that knife and that block of wood and whittled." He paused. "I think he was making you something to come home to." She held the wooden horse against her chest, and Silas thought about her hands, the hands that had fed his boys, mended his shirts, braided Jody's rope, baked the bread his youngest son had saved because she'd told him there was enough for 3 days, and he'd believed her. He looked at those hands and understood something he'd been too afraid to understand before. Love was not a thing that struck you. It was the work someone did when they had every reason to leave and didn't. If this story is moving you, you are exactly who we wrote it for. A like and a subscribe tells us to keep going. We don't make these for everyone. We make them for you. "Come home," he said. She looked at him. She looked at the wooden horse. She looked at the dark road that led back to the valley. "The water's still cut," she said. "His men are still out there. You can't fight Hollister Crow by yourself." "No," he said. "I can't." She stood. She picked up her bag. She held the reins while he mounted. His ribs wouldn't let him do it alone. And then she swung up behind him and put her arms around his waist, carefully, the way you put your arms around a man with broken ribs, and they rode north toward the valley in the dark. They reached the ranch as the sky turned gray. The house was dark. The fence was still broken. But when they came into the yard, the door opened and Whit stood there with the rifle aimed, steady, his eye to the sight. And when he saw them, he lowered it, and his face did something Silas would remember for the rest of his life. It cracked. The stone face he'd been building for 12 years, the wall he'd constructed to survive losing his mother and losing Etta and watching his father get beaten. It cracked, and underneath it was just a boy. Then Jody was past him, barefoot across the yard, and he hit Etta like a small cannonball, and she caught him and his arms were around her neck, and he was saying "Mama, Mama, Mama," not because he'd forgotten, but because he'd remembered, and in that moment he was done pretending. Whit stood on the porch. He didn't run. He walked down the steps slowly and stood in front of Etta and said, "I saved you some bread." He held out the piece, dry, stale, crumbling, and Etta took it and held it the way she held the wooden horse, like it was the most valuable thing in the world, and Whit put his arms around her waist and pressed his face into her shoulder and didn't make a sound. Silas watched from the mare. He held the reins. He let them have this. He would have his turn. But this was theirs. They had 4 days before Crow's deadline. Etta pulled the land patent papers from the trunk and laid them on the kitchen table. She read through them methodically, tracing the old script, translating the legal language the way her father had taught her in a clerk's office in Umatilla County. The original land patent for this ranch was filed in 1872, she said, before Purcell ever filed on the upstream parcel. The patent includes riparian water rights to Indian Creek, full flow rights, granted to this land, not to Purcell's. When Crow bought the water rights from Purcell, he bought nothing. Purcell never had them to sell. Will that hold? Silas asked. In a federal court? Yes. The patent is a federal document. It supersedes any territorial claim. She looked at him. But Crow doesn't care about courts. He cares about fear. He's been taking this Valley One ranch at a time because nobody's had the papers. We've got the papers. Papers don't stop men with guns. Silas looked at the rifle on the wall. He looked at the papers. He looked at his boys, who were listening from the hallway with the intensity of children who've learned that adults' decisions are the difference between sleeping in a house and sleeping in a wagon. Then we need both, he said. He rode to Gant's ranch first. Gant was on his porch, whittling, as he always was. He looked at Silas's face and set down his knife. Took you long enough, Gant said. Silas showed him the papers. Gant read them slowly, his lips moving. My place was filed in 74, 2 years after yours. Etta thinks the same water rights apply to every original patent in the valley. Crow's claims are fraudulent across the board. Gant was quiet for a long time. Then he said, the Hadleys are in Dillon. The Perkins are in Bozeman. Bring them. On the last day of the month, Silas rode into Virginia City with Gant and 3 other men. Tom Hadley, Joe Perkins, and a neighbor named Crow Feather Smith who'd been hiding his dislike of Hollister Crow behind a nickname and a grin for 6 years. Etta rode beside Silas. The boys stayed with Gant's wife, who'd come down to the ranch the night before with a shotgun and a pie and an expression that said no one was getting past her. They found Crow in the saloon, playing cards with 2 of his riders. He saw Silas come through the doors, and his face did the thing that powerful men's faces do when they see someone they expected to have surrendered. It tightened at the corners. Trimble, he said. End of the month. I'm assuming you're here to sign. Silas dropped the papers on Crow's cards. These are federal land patents, Silas said. His voice was low. It was always low, but the saloon was quiet and low-carried. Filed in 1872. They grant water rights to Indian Creek to the downstream patent holders. You bought water from a man who never owned it. Your claim is fraudulent. Every claim in this valley is fraudulent. Crow looked at the papers. He smiled the way a man smiles when he believes the law is something that happens to other people. And who's going to enforce that? The sheriff? He glanced at the sheriff, who was sitting at the bar, looking uncomfortable. The Federal Land Office, Etta said, stepping forward. She had the patent copy, a letter she'd drafted, and the certainty of a woman who'd grown up reading filings. I've already sent a certified copy to the land office in Helena. It'll be there by Thursday. The saloon was very still. Crow's smile didn't fall. It froze. There is a difference. You're a cook, Crow said to Etta. He said it the way Silas's wife's fever had been just a cold, a dismissal that would cost him everything. I'm the daughter of a county clerk who taught me to read land patents before I could read novels, Etta said. And I'm the woman who found your fraud in a trunk while you were busy threatening a man who was already broken. Crow stood. His riders stood. The sheriff stood, not with Crow, but slowly, like a man deciding which side of history he wanted to be found on. Hadley, Silas said. Tom Hadley stepped forward. Perkins. Joe Perkins stepped forward. Smith. Crow Feather Smith stepped forward, and the grin he'd been hiding for 6 years was gone. And what was underneath it was the face of a man who'd been waiting for this day the way dry ground waits for rain. Crow looked at the men. He looked at the papers. He looked at the sheriff, who was now standing with his hand on his badge, not his gun. It's over, Crow, Gant said from the door, where he'd been standing the whole time, blocking the exit, his mule tied outside looking through the window with an expression of bovine patience. It was over. Not that day, not in that saloon, but it began there. The Federal Land Office in Helena confirmed the patents within the month. Crow's water claims were voided. The land he'd taken from the Hadleys and the Perkins was ordered returned. The cattle he'd killed were assessed at market value and deducted from his bank accounts, which he no longer controlled, because the territorial examiner found discrepancies in his books going back 6 years. Hollister Crow was arrested that October for fraud and cattle rustling and assault. His riders scattered before the first frost. His ranch was seized to pay his debts. He was convicted the following spring and sentenced to the territorial prison in Deer Lodge, where the walls were thick and the valley he'd tried to own was far away and getting farther every mile. The Hadleys came home. The Perkins came home. Gant whittled a new fence post and put it in the ground and said, "About damn time." Silas married Etta on a Sunday in November, in the front room of the ranch house, with the boys beside them and Gant as witness and Gant's wife holding a shotgun against the wall just in case anyone objected. The preacher came from Virginia City and didn't charge them. The first honest thing that man had done in a year. Whit held the ring. He'd carved it himself from a piece of elk antler because there was no money for gold and because Whit understood something about making things with your hands that most adults never learn. The value is in the making, not the material. Jody cried, not from sadness, from the kind of joy that is too big for a 7-year-old body, the kind that has to come out as tears because there is nowhere else for it to go. Etta wore her good dress, the one she'd carried in her flour sack, and Silas looked at her, and his face did the thing it did when something broke through his walls. It went still, then soft. Then he looked away, not because he didn't want to see her, but because he wanted to remember the exact way she looked in that light, with his boys beside her for the rest of his life. Spring came back to the Madison Valley the way it always did, grudging at first, then all at once, like an argument that turns into laughter. The creek ran full and clean. The cattle grazed the south pasture in the long evening light. Etta hung washing on the line, and the sheets caught the wind and bellied out like sails, and Jody ran through them laughing. And Whit sat on the porch carving something new. Not a horse this time, but a house, small and careful, with a door that opened. Etta stood at the rail fence watching the valley green around her, and Silas came up behind her and put his hand on her shoulder the way she had once put her hand on Whit's. Gentle, certain, a touch that said breathe. She breathed. The light fell through the kitchen window onto the flour-dusted table, onto the wooden horse on the sill worn smooth now by a boy's thumb, onto the woman standing there with bread in her hands who had been told her whole life she was plain and ordinary and not enough, and she stood there in the warmth of a house that was finally full, and the bread was rising, and so was everything else. Next, we'll tell the story of a woman who was left at the altar in a mining town in the Colorado Rockies, and the quiet, scarred blacksmith who walked her home through a blizzard and never said a word about love until the spring thaw, when she found every gate on her property had been mended overnight, every morning for 4 months, without a signature or a name.